It begins with an almost forgotten entry in a War Office memorandum dated January 1941. A small, disciplined force, delivered by air, may reach targets the enemy believes unreachable. At a time when Britain struggled to land any meaningful blow on Axis territory, this proposal was more than bold, it was revolutionary. And for the handful of men selected from No. 11 Independent Company, it marked the first steps toward a mission that few believed could succeed, and even fewer expected to return from. The challenge facing British commanders in early 1941 was daunting. The fall of France, the siege of Malta, and crippling shortages of equipment left Britain on the defensive. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded an offensive action, something symbolic, something that would shake Italian confidence and show the world that Britain was far from defeated. The answer emerged from a small group of officers experimenting with airborne warfare, inspired partly by German Fallschirmjäger successes in Norway and the Low Countries. If Germany could use paratroopers to seize strategic objectives, why couldn't Britain? The only trouble was that Britain had no formal airborne units, no doctrine, and scarcely any equipment suited for the task. But what they possessed was determination, and a willingness to take enormous risks. The men chosen for the mission were volunteers from No. 11 Independent Company, a formation created originally for raids along the Norwegian coast. These soldiers had already trained for harsh conditions, but their new assignment required a different kind of preparation. They were moved to Ringway Airfield near Manchester, the center of Britain's early airborne experiments. There, under the supervision of the Central Landing Establishment, they practiced parachute jumps from converted Whitley bombers, learned demolition techniques, and studied aerial photographs of a remote valley in southern Italy. Their target was the Trojino Aqueduct near the town of Colletri. Built of reinforced concrete, the aqueduct carried water vital to Italian military operations across the region. Damaging it, British planners believed, could disrupt local industry and demonstrate Italy's vulnerability. Yet the strategic value was not the only motivation. Success would prove that British airborne forces were viable. As Captain Gerald Jerry Tucker later wrote in a letter to his wife, "We are to strike at something the Italians believe safe by distance alone. If we succeed, it will change what the army believes possible." Training was relentless. Men practiced open-field landings, silent regrouping, and nighttime navigation using only compass bearings. They drilled repeatedly on how to move from the drop zone to the objective without being detected. And always hanging over them was the uncertainty of the mission's extraction plan. There would be no aircraft returning to pick them up. Instead, after blowing the aqueduct, the men were expected to trek miles across unfamiliar countryside to a planned coastal extraction point, if they could avoid Italian patrols long enough to make it. Despite the intense preparation, reality quietly intruded on the optimism. The Whitley bombers were notoriously cramped, forcing soldiers to crawl to the jump hatch. Parachutes were new enough that malfunctions were not uncommon. And navigation over the Mediterranean at night, with blackout conditions and winter weather, was an unpredictable gamble. Records from the Central Landing Establishment include a blunt assessment. Operational success depends overwhelmingly on fortune and weather. Yet morale among the volunteers remained surprisingly high. For many, this was a chance to strike back, directly and decisively, at the Axis powers. Private Tom Dykes wrote in his diary, "Whatever happens, at least we'll be doing something. Not waiting. Not hiding. Something." That sentiment echoed across the ranks, binding the men to the mission's secrecy and danger. As January turned to February, final briefings emphasized the unprecedented nature of the operation. Intelligence officers warned the team that Italian defenses in the region were inconsistent. Some patrols were lax, others vigilant and unpredictable. Civilian sightings could compromise the mission. Communications would be limited once they jumped. And if captured, the men would likely be interrogated intensely, as airborne forces were virtually unknown to Italian intelligence at the time. Still, on the night before departure, the men lined up their gear, checked their demolition charges, and memorized every detail of the valley where the aqueduct stood. No one spoke openly about fear, but journals and later testimonies suggest a silent understanding. The mission was historic, but also perilous. Major Tag Pritchard, the operations commander, reportedly told his men, "Our job is to show them what British soldiers can do in the dark." When the aircraft arrived to transport them to Malta, the staging point for the final jump, the men climbed aboard with a mixture of excitement and unease. Engines roared, men tightened their harnesses, and the first British airborne strike force lifted into the winter sky. Ahead of them lay uncertainty. The aqueduct, the drop zone, the Italian countryside, and an operation for which there was no precedent, no guarantee, and no turning back. As the Whitleys disappeared into the night, one question hung in the air, one that would only grow heavier in the hours to come. Would this daring idea reshape British strategy, or become a tragic footnote in the long, brutal winter of 1941? The records from RAF Lucca in Malta tell a quiet but revealing story. On February 7, 1941, ground crews noted the arrival of several Whitley aircraft carrying unusual personnel and cargo. The entry gives no names, no unit designations, only the vague description typical of wartime secrecy. But behind that simple line was the arrival of the first British paratroopers ever sent on an operational mission. Their journey from training grounds in Britain to the stark wind-battered airfields of Malta marked the point where theory shifted into reality. Malta in early 1941 was a place of tension. Constantly bombed, chronically short of fuel, and under threat of invasion, it was one of the most heavily contested islands in the world. The men of No. 11 Independent Company were struck by the contrast. Children wandering among air raid rubble, anti-aircraft guns positioned behind stone farmhouses, soldiers sleeping fully dressed in case of sudden attack. Yet for the paratroopers, the island also represented safety of a different kind. An isolated staging point from which Italy could be reached under cover of darkness, and where the enemy had not yet guessed at Britain's new airborne ambitions. Their days in Malta were consumed by final rehearsals. Maps were spread across makeshift tables in old barracks. Officers walked the men through every approach path to the Trojano Valley, stressing the need for silence, speed, and improvisation. To ensure the team understood the terrain, intelligence officers presented grainy reconnaissance photographs. But these images, taken at high altitude, left much to interpretation. One paratrooper later recalled that, "The photos told us what the aqueduct generally looked like, but not what hid in the trees or behind the bends of the ravine." Here, the human struggle sharpened. The men had trained for months, but none of them had ever jumped into enemy territory. They asked quiet questions during downtime. Would Italian sentries be close to the target? Would locals react with fear or hostility? What if the Whitleys came in too high or too low? Some scribbled quick notes to families, letters that could only be delivered if they returned. Many tore them up afterward, fearing superstition more than death. To ground their fears in something practical, the officers pushed more drills. Lieutenant Anthony Dean Drummond, one of the key members of the team, emphasized the importance of regrouping quickly after landing. "The moment your feet touch the ground," he told them, "you have one job: find your section. Everything depends on that." He knew firsthand how darkness, wind, or a poorly timed jump could scatter paratroopers across miles of countryside. His words were recorded in later debriefs, serving as a reminder of how fragile airborne operations were in their infancy. Yet beneath all the preparation, beneath the discipline and stoicism, was an unspoken truth. The intelligence picture was incomplete. Italian defenses in the region were inconsistent. Some villages maintained local patrols, others had none at all. There were rumors of mobile carabinieri units moving unpredictably through the countryside, and the Italian military rarely followed systematic routines. It added an unpredictable quality to the mission, one Britain could not fully plan around. This uncertainty shaped the tone of the final briefings. Major Tag Pritchard stood before his men in a dimly lit room on the outskirts of the airfield. He laid out the sequence of events: the flight path from Malta to southern Italy, the planned drop zones, the approach routes to the aqueduct, the placement of charges, and finally, most uncertain of all, the escape south toward the coast. One of the men later recalled Pritchard's voice as calm, matter-of-fact, as if he understood the risk but refused to be intimidated by it. But an unusual detail emerged during this briefing. one that introduced a note of mystery. A last-minute intelligence update mentioned the possibility of Italian engineers conducting work near the aqueduct. No explanation was given, not the reason for the work, nor the number of workers, nor whether soldiers were accompanying them. It was a small, ambiguous piece of information, but it forced the officers to reconsider the timing of their approach. Would the engineers be there at night? Had someone tipped off the Italians? Or was it coincidence, the simple maintenance of critical infrastructure? The briefing moved on, but the uncertainty lingered. The final hours on Malta were filled with routine, checking parachute harnesses, inspecting Sten guns and revolvers, loading demolition charges into packs carefully wrapped to prevent moisture damage. Men spoke in hushed tones. Some sat alone on stone walls overlooking the airfield, watching the sun drop behind the Maltese hills. The island's ever-present wind carried the smell of dust and aviation fuel. Then, near midnight on February 10th, an officer entered the barracks with a simple message: "Prepare to move." There was no dramatic speech, no ceremony. The men stood, collected their kits, and walked toward the waiting aircraft. The WWIIs were lined up with engines warming, their silhouettes flickering in the glow of ground crew lanterns. As the paratroopers climbed aboard, the tension of the previous days crystallized into a sharp, focused clarity. They knew their jump would mark the opening chapter of British airborne warfare. They also knew that the smallest error, a misread map, a sudden cloud bank, an unexpected patrol, could unravel the mission entirely. The aircraft lifted into the night one by one, disappearing over the dark waters of the Mediterranean. Behind them, Malta dimmed to a speck. Ahead lay Italy, its coastline cloaked in black, its valleys silent, and its defenses uncertain. What none of them knew, as the engines droned steadily northward, was just how quickly those uncertainties would turn their mission into a chaotic test of survival. The flight into Italy began with a detail that seldom appears in official reports. The WWII bombers carried no escort, no backup aircraft, and no contingency support of any kind. They were alone, crossing one of the most unpredictable stretches of the Mediterranean during winter. RAF pilots later described the crossing as a gamble made with darkness itself, and for the paratroopers packed tightly inside the fuselage, that gamble became increasingly real with each mile they flew. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was tense and claustrophobic. The WWII's narrow fuselage forced the men to crouch or sit with their knees drawn tight. The drone of the engines was so loud that conversation became little more than gestures: thumbs up, a nod, a hand on a shoulder. Dim red lights cast long shadows across their equipment, giving the interior a surreal, almost submarine-like quality. The air smelled of fuel, leather harnesses, and canvas parachute packs. One man later wrote, "It felt as if we were being carried not by aircraft, but by fate." The struggle began almost immediately. Turbulence over the sea jolted the aircraft, causing loose gear to rattle violently. The pilots fought crosswinds that drifted them off course, forcing constant corrections. Navigation depended largely on dead reckoning. Radio silence was essential to avoid detection. As thick winter clouds closed in around the aircraft, the crew lost sight of reference stars used for orientation. It was the kind of night where, even in peacetime, flying required nerve. In wartime, flying into an enemy homeland, it demanded something more: trust. Inside the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Dean Drummond repeatedly checked his small compass, trying to maintain a sense of direction. But he knew that once they exited the aircraft, they would be alone with whatever conditions awaited them. The intelligence briefings had warned of hills, fields, and unpredictable winds near the valley of the Trojano aqueduct. But photographs taken from thousands of feet offered little insight into what the ground truly looked like. At night, under blackout conditions, the unknown multiplied. Then came the first serious challenge. Some of the aircraft drifted north of the planned flight path. A later RAF navigation report admitted that wind speeds had been underestimated. The effect was subtle, but devastating. The WWIIs crossed the Italian coastline earlier, and farther north, than intended. The coastline itself was invisible beneath cloud cover, and the pilots had nothing but instruments and instinct to guide them. Italian anti-aircraft posts, luckily, did not detect the low-flying aircraft, or if they did, they mistook them for routine traffic. When the aircraft reached the approximate drop zone, the pilots executed a wide turn. But the valley below was shrouded in darkness, and key landmarks were obscured. In some aircraft, the green jump light came on too soon. In others, too late. The accuracy of the entire operation now rested on a handful of seconds. Major Pritchard, positioned near the hatch, gave the order, "Go!" The first men leapt into the black void, disappearing instantly. The roar of the aircraft vanished the moment they were swallowed by the air. The jump was rough. Gusts threw some men sideways, twisting parachute lines. Others dropped through sudden pockets of still air, their landings harder than expected. When the chutes finally opened, the landscape below offered no comfort. Scattered farmhouses, pockets of woodland, ridges with sharp gradients, and no clear sign of the ravine leading to the aqueduct. The drop went wrong almost immediately. Groups landed up to a mile apart, far beyond the planned dispersal radius. One paratrooper came down in the branches of a tall tree, dangling until he could cut himself free. Another touched down in a plowed field, sinking into mud so thick he struggled to stand. A few landed near barking farm dogs, forcing them to scramble hurriedly away in the dark to avoid detection. The silence of the valley was punctuated only by whispered calls, soft clicks of signal devices, and the rustle of men gathering equipment. Regrouping was chaotic. Pritchard's team used prearranged signals to locate each other, but the terrain was more fragmented than the recon photos suggested. Dry stone walls divided fields into tight grids. Thorny brush slowed movement. The moon, obscured by clouds, provided little illumination. The men had to navigate by compass, counting steps, checking bearings, and hoping they weren't walking into an Italian patrol. And yet, despite the confusion, a remarkable thing happened. The teams began to converge. One group linked up with another near a small hillside olive grove. From there, using whispered directions and hand signals, they moved toward the predetermined rendezvous point. Time pressed heavily on them. They needed to reach the aqueduct before dawn. Every delay increased the risk of encountering Italian sentries. But suspicion lingered in the back of Dean Drummond's mind. As he noted later, something about the valley felt alert. Lights flickered briefly in a distant farmhouse. A dog barked repeatedly in a way that seemed unnatural. He wondered whether the last-minute intelligence note about Italian engineers had been more serious than headquarters realized. Were Italians already near the aqueduct? Were they armed? Had the jump been detected somehow? The men pressed on, each step taking them deeper into territory where a single sound could betray them. Their mission depended on speed, silence, and luck, three things that had already been tested by the night's chaos. As they approached the final ridgeline overlooking the Trojano Valley, dawn still an hour away, they paused briefly. Below them, hidden in darkness, stood the aqueduct. The objective was close. But so too were the unknowns the intelligence reports had warned of. And as they prepared for the assault, they realized the hardest part of the operation was yet to come. A seldom-cited engineering note from pre-war Italy describes the Trojano Aqueduct as a structure designed to withstand time, weather, and sabotage. Those words, written years before the outbreak of global conflict, would take on new weight as the British paratroopers approached it under cover of darkness. Their mission, carved into secrecy since its conception, now stood balanced between precision and improvisation. The aqueduct was close, far closer than the paratroopers expected after their scattered landings, and the silence of the valley amplified every heartbeat, every footfall, every shift of equipment. The men gathered beneath a line of trees on the ridgeline. Using hand signals, Major Pritchard guided them into formation. Some were still missing, others had arrived breathless from sprinting across uneven fields. Despite the difficult night, the majority had regrouped. Their faces were streaked with mud and sweat, their clothes torn by brambles, but their resolve held firm. In the distance, barely visible in the pale pre-dawn glow, stood the massive concrete structure they had trained for months to destroy. From this vantage point, the aqueduct resembled a skeletal bridge, tall arches supported by thick pillars, spanning a narrow ravine. The engineers among the group whispered quick assessments: where to place charges, where stress points lay, how the structure might collapse. Captain Tucker, responsible for the demolition plan, quietly reviewed each detail with his team. "We have one chance," he murmured, a phrase recorded later in his debrief. "One clean strike, or none of this matters." The struggle began the moment they descended the ridge. The terrain was far more complex than anticipated. Dense undergrowth concealed rocks and hidden drops. Dry stone walls forced the men to climb or detour around them, slowing progress. Every movement risked noise: a snapped twig, a clatter of loose stones, the ripple of fabric. With dawn approaching, the balance between speed and silence became agonizing. Yet the valley remained strangely still. No patrols. No vehicles. No voices. The silence raised questions the men dared not speak aloud. Had the Italians already left the area? Had they shifted their guard routines? Or, more troubling, were they watching from cover, waiting for the intruders to reveal themselves? The paratroopers reached the base of the aqueduct just as the first gray light began to wash over the hills. Up close, the structure was even larger than photographs suggested. The concrete was colder, thicker, more imposing. It was the kind of target designed to look indestructible. But the British plan was elegant in its simplicity. Place charges at key stress points, detonate them in 2 coordinated blasts, and cripple the aqueduct long enough to disrupt Italian logistics in the region. Tucker and his sappers moved with rehearsed precision. They unpacked Primacord, gelignite, and wooden clamps designed to secure charges to the concrete arches. Men took up security positions along the perimeter, scanning for movement. The silence felt unnatural, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. At one point, Dean Drummond noted a faint metallic sound echoing faintly along the ravine, something like a distant tool striking stone. But it never repeated. Was it an echo from their own equipment? Or evidence of Italian engineers working nearby, just as the intelligence brief had hinted? The insight came in the form of an unexpected complication. When Tucker examined one of the key arches, he noticed signs of recent repair. Fresh concrete, smoother than the surrounding surface. If Italian workers had been reinforcing the structure, the original demolition calculations might be off. The charges might not propagate correctly. The damage might be less severe. Tucker adjusted his plan, adding a secondary placement to compensate. The change would cost precious minutes, but it was necessary. With the charges finally set, the men withdrew to a safe distance. They crouched behind a natural embankment, breathing heavily, waiting for Tucker's signal. In his pocket was a simple watch, its second hand sweeping a steady circle. When he reached the designated detonation moment, he triggered the charge. The explosion tore through the valley with a thunderous crack. Dust and smoke billowed upward as the shockwave echoed off the hillsides. Chunks of concrete collapsed, falling in jagged fragments. One of the arches buckled visibly, tilting under its own weight. The aqueduct shuddered, then fractured. But when the dust cleared, it became apparent that the structure had not collapsed entirely. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. Water flow was disrupted, but not completely severed. The engineers' recent repairs had indeed strengthened parts of the aqueduct, absorbing some of the blast's force. It was a partial success, a moral victory, but not the strategic knockout the planners hoped for. Still, the operation had made its mark. Sirens began to wail faintly from a distant village. The paratroopers had minutes, at most, to begin their escape toward the rendezvous route south. But questions lingered in their minds. Had the explosion alerted only nearby civilians? Or had Italian engineers already been close enough to witness everything? Why had the valley been so quiet during their approach? As they gathered their gear and prepared to move, the first signs of Italian mobilization began to stir along the horizon. A truck engine growled. A distant shout carried on the wind. The men of Operation Colossus had completed their objective, but the path to freedom would be far more perilous than the path to the aqueduct. And the mystery of who might already be searching for them was only beginning to unfold. In the official British report written weeks after Operation Colossus, one line stands out with stark simplicity: no aircraft available for extraction. It was a logistical fact, acknowledged from the beginning, yet it carried enormous weight for the men now fleeing the Trojano Valley. They had parachuted, regrouped, and sabotaged a key Axis installation. But unlike later airborne missions, there would be no Whitley circling back for them, no covert rendezvous with friendly forces. Their escape depended entirely on their legs, their maps, and the slimmest hope that Italian security forces remained confused long enough for them to slip away. As the dust from the aqueduct blast drifted across the valley, the paratroopers moved rapidly southward. Their objective was straightforward in theory: reach the coast near the mouth of the Seal River, where a submarine or small vessel might extract them. The route, however, crossed miles of territory filled with unknowns: farms, villages, patrol routes, and isolated roads that Italian forces used sporadically. The men traveled in small groups, maintaining silence as they cut through olive groves and skirted stone farmhouses. At first, the only sounds came from the wind moving through the valley. But within minutes, faint alarms echoed from the direction of Calitri, confirming what they already suspected: the Italians were mobilizing. The struggle intensified rapidly. Exhaustion from the night's jump and the demolition work pressed on every step. Many carried heavy packs filled with the remnants of their gear. Others had minor injuries: twisted ankles, scraped hands, bruises from hard landings. Even so, discipline held. Pritchard ordered the team to move in staggered columns to avoid presenting a clear target. Their training emphasized stealth over speed, but now the balance had shifted. Every minute mattered. As they crossed a series of terraced fields, a farmer spotted them from a distance, frozen in place as he watched the strange figures in British uniforms slipping through the dawn haze. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, the farmer turned and hurried toward a dirt road leading to the nearest village. The paratroopers knew instantly what it meant. Within an hour, perhaps less, Carabinieri patrols would be swarming the area. They accelerated their pace. Yet Italian forces responded with surprising efficiency. Though Italy's military reputation is often unfairly reduced to stereotypes, records from the region demonstrate that local commanders acted quickly and decisively upon hearing reports of parachutists. Patrols were ordered to block movement along key roads. Checkpoints sprang up in villages the British had hoped to bypass. Word spread through rural communities, many of which relied on strict loyalty to local authorities. Civilians were instructed to report any suspicious movement. The atmosphere grew tighter by the minute. The paratroopers continued south, navigating by compass and the faint outlines of distant hills. Lieutenant Dean Drummond later wrote in his diary, "It felt as though the countryside was watching us. Every shutter, every courtyard, every field." The sense of unseen eyes watching their progress brought a new psychological pressure, one that perfectly matched the intelligence uncertainties that had shadowed the mission from the beginning. By mid-morning, the groups became fragmented again. Thick brush separated units. Some veered east to avoid a barking dog that threatened to alert a nearby household. Others crossed a shallow river and found themselves on the wrong side of a steep ridge. In more than one instance, they halted at the sound of distant engines, Italian patrol trucks fanning across the region. The men huddled in thickets or behind dry stone walls as the engines grew louder, their hearts pounding as shadows stretched across the ground. A small detail from one patrol report lends chilling context. Italian officers believed the airborne force consisted of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of men. Rumors even suggested an impending landing along the coast. This misunderstanding drove a much larger mobilization than the British expected. Instead of a handful of patrols, entire battalions were alerted. The countryside became a net slowly tightening around fewer than 40 exhausted soldiers. By afternoon, the first group was intercepted. They were moving across a narrow footpath when they encountered a line of Carabinieri rifles pointed directly at them. Outnumbered and out of ammunition, the paratroopers surrendered. Their capture was almost anticlimactic. No firefight, no dramatic standoff. just the slow realization that their escape route had collapsed. The other groups tried desperately to continue south, but the pattern repeated with grim consistency. Each time they approached a village, they found patrols waiting. Each time they attempted to slip through woodland or farmland, civilians spotted them. One group hid for hours in a grove only to be surrounded after a shepherd reported their presence. Major Pritchard's team made it the farthest, navigating rugged terrain in hopes of breaking through the tightening Italian perimeter. But by evening, weakened by fatigue and cut off from water, they too were surrounded. The Italian soldiers who captured them seemed surprised more than triumphant. Some even expressed admiration for the daring operation. But orders were orders. The men were marched to holding stations for interrogation. The reveal came slowly over the next 24 hours. Word spread through Italian channels that all paratroopers had been captured. None had escaped to the coast. None had reached the extraction point. Their fate became a matter of uncertainty in London, where intelligence officers waited for news that never came. For the men, the mystery was immediate and personal. How had the Italians responded so quickly? Had someone seen the aircraft? Had the last-minute intelligence hint about engineers been more significant than believed? Or were they merely victims of a perfect storm of geography, timing, and human vigilance? Those questions would linger. And as the paratroopers were transported deeper into Italy under guard, they began to realize that their mission, though partially successful, had set in motion consequences far beyond the destruction of the Trojano aqueduct. Some of those consequences would reshape Allied airborne strategy. Others would lead to darker, more uncertain chapters still to come. In the aftermath of Operation Colossus, a curious note surfaced in an Italian military communiqué. Prisoners captured appear to be of an airborne type not previously encountered. The phrasing was clinical, almost sterile, yet it revealed something profound. These captured soldiers, exhausted, mud-covered, and carrying strange harnesses and unfamiliar equipment, were the first British paratroopers the Italian military had ever seen. Their very existence confirmed a new dimension of the war, one that would reshape strategy on both sides. But for the men themselves, now prisoners of the Regio Esercito, it was the beginning of an uncertain journey marked by interrogation, surprise, and unanswered questions. The paratroopers were transported in small groups to various holding areas before being consolidated at a larger POW facility. The initial interrogations were disorganized. Italian officers had little understanding of airborne operations and struggled to interpret the men's gear. One officer reportedly asked how many additional troops would be descending from the sky, as if expecting waves of parachutists to follow. The British maintained discipline, adhering to name, rank, and serial number. Yet the confusion among their captors raised a lingering puzzle. How much did Italy actually know about the mission beforehand, and had local engineers or patrols been tipped off by something the British intelligence team overlooked? During these early days, the struggle for the prisoners was twofold. Physically, they were exhausted and underfed, their uniforms soaked from crossing rivers and sweating through long marches. Mentally, they grappled with the sting of capture so soon after completing their objective. Some journals recovered after the war quoted men who felt they had let the mission down, even though the aqueduct had been successfully sabotaged. But the truth was more complex. The mission itself had never included a guaranteed way home. In its earliest conception, Operation Colossus was as much an experiment as a strategic strike. Italian propaganda quickly seized on the capture. Local newspapers printed photographs of the British soldiers, describing them as saboteurs, rather than legitimate combatants. Yet not all Italians viewed them harshly. Several guards, many of them reservists from rural backgrounds, expressed curiosity and even sympathy. One guard admitted to Pritchard, "We did not know the British had men who jumped from airplanes." The prisoners sensed a mix of admiration and confusion, a recognition of boldness rarely seen along this quiet stretch of southern Italy. Insight into the broader impact of the mission came slowly. Italian engineers inspected the damaged aqueduct within hours of the explosion and confirmed that repairs would take several weeks. While the structure had not fully collapsed, the disruption was meaningful. It forced Italy to divert manpower and resources at a time when Mussolini's military campaigns in Greece and North Africa were already strained. The attack, though limited in material impact, carried psychological weight. The British had proven that distance and geography no longer guaranteed safety. Back in London, the War Office received fragmented reports. A missing aircraft. Intercepted Italian claims. Then, gradually, confirmation. All paratroopers captured. Yet the reaction was not defeat or embarrassment. Instead, British planners saw something else, a proof of concept. Despite navigation errors, scattered landings, and rapid Italian mobilization, the men had reached their target and inflicted damage. It was, in the words of one post-operation memo, a victory of method rather than magnitude. Operation Colossus demonstrated that airborne troops could be delivered behind enemy lines. And it revealed exactly where doctrine, equipment, and training needed improvement. The application of these lessons would echo throughout the war. From the formation of the Parachute Regiment to the later operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, many airborne leaders traced their early principles back to Colossus. Dean Drummond himself would later escape captivity, returning to Britain to help develop airborne training and long-range penetration tactics. The influence of those first chaotic hours over Italy would ripple outward, shaping how airborne warfare evolved. Yet even years later, unresolved questions lingered. Why had the valley been so quiet during the approach to the target, only for Italian patrols to mobilize with such efficiency hours later? Had the farmer who spotted them been the catalyst for the rapid response? Or had Italian engineers working near the aqueduct seen something unusual before dawn? Some historians even speculate that the unusual repairs discovered by Tucker may have been routine, or may have been part of a quiet Italian effort to reinforce vulnerable structures amid rumors of Allied sabotage operations elsewhere. The archives offer no definitive answer. What remains clear is that the mystery around the operation, the scattered jump, the rapid capture, the unexpected Italian alertness, became part of the story's enduring intrigue. These moments of uncertainty, rather than diminishing the mission, lent it a character that later airborne veterans regarded with a mix of pride and somber respect. The close of this chapter in 1941 did not feel like an ending to the men who lived it. For them, captivity was only another trial in a war that had already tested them in extraordinary ways. Yet looking back, Operation Colossus marked the beginning of modern British airborne strategy, the spark that ignited future operations across Europe and beyond. And as those first British paratroopers were marched deeper into Italy, one truth remained. They had jumped into the unknown, changed the course of military history, and proven that even in the darkest winter of the war, bold ideas could still reshape the battlefield.